One of the hardest moments in life is when life falls apart. You reach for God, and all you hear is silence. No answer, no sign, no peace. Just the ache of needing help and feeling like heaven has gone quiet. And that silence can make the mind spiral. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I'm being ignored. Maybe God has abandoned me. But what if God's silence isn't absence? What if the silence is where your false image of God starts breaking? Let's be honest. When people say, God is always with you, that can sound comforting when life is calm. But when you're exhausted, grieving, or emotionally worn down, that phrase can feel empty. Because in that moment, you don't want a concept. You want help. You want relief. You want clarity. You want some sign that you are not alone in this. And when nothing comes, it can feel personal. It can feel like spiritual rejection. That's the part many people don't talk about. They talk about faith after the breakthrough. They talk about trust after the storm has passed. They talk about the lesson once the pain makes sense. But they rarely talk about the middle. The place where you are still hurting, still praying, still trying, still waiting, and still hearing nothing. That middle place is where the mind becomes dangerous, because the mind cannot tolerate silence. The mind needs a reason. The mind needs a timeline. The mind needs an explanation. So when God does not answer in the way the mind expects, the mind creates its own answer. God is gone. God doesn't care. God is punishing me. But silence and abandonment are not the same thing. Silence means the form of communication you expected has stopped. Abandonment means love has left. Those aren't the same. Most people were taught to imagine God as someone outside of them, a being that's far away, a power that either gives or withholds, a presence that provides itself through signs, blessings, and outcomes. So when life becomes painful, the mind naturally looks outward. God, fix this. God, explain this. God, show me what to do. There's nothing wrong with praying for help. There's nothing wrong with wanting comfort. But the problem begins when the mind decides exactly how God must respond in order to be real. If God is real, I should feel peace right now. If God is with me, this should stop hurting. If God loves me, I shouldn't feel this alone. That is where the false image begins to crack. Because God is not just the force that makes pain disappear. God is the presence that remains even when pain is still here. And that's hard for the mind. The mind wants God to be an emergency exit. Push the prayer button, receive relief. Feel fear, receive certainty. Experience pain, receive rescue. But the living presence of God is deeper than emotional reassurance. If your connection to God depends entirely on whether you feel comforted, then your faith is not resting in God. It is resting in a feeling. And feelings change. God feels silent when you are trying to find God as an object inside your experience. A feeling, a sign, a clear answer. But God is not merely something that appears inside awareness. God is the depth in which awareness itself appears. God is not only a voice inside the silence. God is the silence in which every voice rises and falls. This is why the mind struggles. The mind can grasp thoughts. It can grasp symbols. It can grasp beliefs. It can grasp emotions. But God cannot be reduced to any of these. So when the mind reaches for God and finds no object to hold, it calls that silence. But the soul may be standing closer to God than ever. Not because life feels good, not because the pain is gone, and not because everything makes sense, but because the old way of relating to God is being stripped away. This is why so many deep encounters with God happen in wilderness, the desert, the night, the garden. These are not just physical places. They're inner states. They're moments where the old self cannot control the encounter anymore. And in that place, God is no longer an idea you hold. God becomes the reality holding you. The monad points to the undivided origin. The reality before the story of me over here, trying to reach God over there. When God feels silent, what may actually be happening is that your awareness is being pulled deeper than the surface relationship your mind understands. The silence exposes how much of your faith has been built around distance. You reaching, God answering. You fearing, God reassuring. You hurting, God fixing. But the deeper truth is not distance. The deeper truth is presence. The source is not absent because your emotions are loud. The source is not gone because your mind is confused. The source is not distant because your life is painful. It's the ground in which the pain, confusion, and silence are all appearing all at once. This does not make your suffering meaningless. It means the silence may be inviting you into a deeper recognition than comfort. Not God come to me, but what is already here before the answer comes. God's silence does not always mean you are being ignored. Sometimes it means the part of you demanding an answer is not the part that can receive the truth. When fear is in control, it doesn't really want truth. It wants relief. When the ego is panicking, it doesn't want surrender. It wants certainty. When the wounded self is desperate, it doesn't want presence. It wants the pain to stop. That's human. There's no shame in that. But it's not the same as openness. Sometimes the answer cannot come in the form you are demanding, because the demand itself is built from fear. Sometimes God feels silent because your fear is too loud to recognize what is subtle. You're asking through panic, listening through panic, interpreting through panic, and panic can't recognize presence. It only recognizes control. So when control doesn't arrive, panic says, God is gone. But God was never the control. God was the presence beneath the collapse of control. So what does this look like in your real life? It looks like praying and still taking the next honest step. It looks like not getting the reassurance you wanted, but noticing you're still breathing, still here, still being carried through this moment. It looks like refusing to turn pain into proof that God has left. It looks like saying, I don't feel guided right now, but I won't let fear define God for me. It looks like being honest instead of performing faith. Real faith is not pretending the silence does not hurt. Real faith is refusing to worship the mind's interpretation of that silence. Sometimes the answer is not a dramatic sign. Sometimes the answer is the strength to continue without knowing. Sometimes the answer is the pause before you spiral. Sometimes the answer is the quiet support that arrives through another person. Sometimes the answer is the strange peace that doesn't remove the pain, but keeps the pain from becoming your identity. Not every answer comes as thunder. Sometimes God speaks through what quietly keeps you from giving up. So if God feels silent when you need Him the most, don't rush to condemn yourself. Don't assume that you're abandoned. Don't let the mind turn pain into a theology of rejection. Pause. Take a deep breath. Look deeper. Maybe the silence isn't the end of the connection. Maybe it's the end of your old image of the connection. Maybe God isn't failing to answer. Maybe the answer is arriving beneath the level where fear expected it. The mind wants God to speak because it doesn't know how to rest in presence. But the soul begins to recognize what the mind cannot grasp. That even here, even in the silence, even before the breakthrough, something remains. Something still holds you. Something still breathes. Something still witnesses the storm without being destroyed by it. This isn't motivation. This is recognition. God has not become absent because your mind cannot hear Him. The silence may be the doorway where belief becomes direct knowing. And the monad reveals what remains when every image, answer, and expectation falls away. Not emptiness. Presence. Not abandonment. Source. Not distance. The reality that was holding you before you ever knew how to ask. Prayer feels the emptiest when you need it to feel real. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. When life is calm, prayer can feel peaceful. It can feel sacred. It can feel like a quiet return to something deeper. But when you're breaking inside, when your chest is tight, your mind is spiraling, your heart is exhausted, and you finally turn toward God with everything you have left. Sometimes there is no warmth. There's no answer, no sudden peace, no feeling that someone is listening. And that can be terrifying, because it's not just silence you are facing. It feels like absence. It feels like abandonment. It feels like you reached for the only thing that was supposed to hold you, and your hand closed around empty air. But what if prayer feels empty in those moments? Not because God is gone, but because the image of God your mind was trying to reach is beginning to collapse. When prayer feels empty, the first thought is usually, what am I doing wrong? Maybe I'm not praying correctly. Maybe I don't have enough faith. Maybe God is disappointed in me. And once the mind begins moving in that direction, prayer stops being communion and becomes performance. You start measuring yourself. You start checking your emotions. You start trying to force sincerity. And then prayer becomes just another place where you feel like you're failing. That's a heavy burden. Because when you are already hurting, the last thing you need is to turn your pain into proof that something is wrong with you. Sometimes prayer feels empty simply because you're exhausted. Not spiritually defective, but exhausted. There are moments when the nervous system is so strained, the heart is so guarded, and the mind is so overloaded that even sacred things feel distant. You can be loved and still feel numb. You can be held and still feel alone. You can be close to God and still feel nothing. Feeling nothing is not proof that God is absent. It may only mean the part of you that wants to feel God is buried beneath fear, grief, and tension. The mind often turns God into an object. Something over there, something outside of you. Something watching, judging, and deciding. And when prayer is built around that image, prayer becomes a transaction. I speak, God responds. I ask, God gives. I suffer, God comforts. I am faithful, God rewards. But real life does not always move that cleanly. Sometimes you pray and the situation doesn't change. Sometimes you cry and the pain doesn't lift. Sometimes you ask for guidance and the path stays unclear. And if your idea of God is based only on response, then silence feels like rejection. That's where the suffering deepens. Because now, you are not only dealing with the pain of your life, you're dealing with the pain of believing God has chosen not to come. But maybe the issue isn't God. Maybe the issue is the image of God the mind created. A God who must answer in a way your fear can recognize. A God who must speak in the language your pain demands. A God who must prove love through immediate relief. And when that image fails, the mind says, God is gone. But maybe what is gone is not God. Maybe what is gone is the mental version of God you were taught to cling to. The prayer that feels empty may be the prayer that finally becomes honest. Because when you no longer feel anything, when your words feel dry, when your faith feels thin, when your old beliefs cannot comfort you anymore, something deeper can begin. Not the prayer of performance, not the prayer of spiritual confidence, and not the prayer that tries to sound strong, but the prayer that simply says, I am here. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to feel. I don't even know what I believe right now, but I am here. That is not a weak prayer. That's a real prayer. Because prayer is not always about producing a sacred feeling. Prayer is not always about receiving an answer. Prayer is not always about escaping pain. Sometimes prayer is the act of staying open when every part of you wants to close. Sometimes prayer is the willingness to stop pretending. Sometimes prayer is the moment you stop trying to control God with words and allow yourself to be fully seen in your emptiness. The mind wants prayer to create a result, but the soul knows prayer is not always a result. Sometimes prayer is relationship without proof, presence without sensation, trust without emotional confirmation. That's hard, but it's also where prayer becomes deeper than the mind. What the Gnostics call the monad points toward the undivided source beneath every image, every concept, every name, and every form. It is not another God competing with God. It is a way of pointing toward the unity behind all appearances, the one before the mind divides reality into here and there. And this matters, because empty prayers often come from separation. You feel like a separate self calling out to a distant God. You feel like a lonely person trying to reach across an invisible gap. You feel like your words must travel somewhere else in order to be heard. But the deeper realization is this: God is not far away, listening from a distance. The presence you are praying to is also the presence in which prayer is even arising. The silence around your words is not empty space. It is the field that allows the words to even appear. The stillness beneath your desperation is not indifference. It is the deeper ground that remains even when emotion disappears. This is why prayer can feel empty when the mind is waiting for an object to answer. Because God is not merely an object inside experience. God is the depth of experience itself. The mind wants a voice. The soul begins to recognize the silence beneath the voice. The mind wants a sign. The soul begins to recognize the space in which every sign appears. The mind wants God to arrive. The deeper truth is that you are already praying inside what you never left. Sometimes prayer feels empty because you are using prayer to avoid feeling what is actually here. You're not really asking for God. You're asking for escape. Escape from uncertainty. Escape from grief. Escape from the truth you already know, but don't want to face. That doesn't make you bad. It makes you human. But if prayer becomes a way to bypass your own inner honesty, it will eventually feel hollow. Because God does not meet the mask. God meets what is real. And sometimes the most powerful prayer isn't, please make this go away. Sometimes it's, show me what I am afraid to feel. Show me what I keep avoiding. Show me where I have confused control with faith. Show me where I want you to rescue an identity you are trying to free me from. That kind of prayer is dangerous to the false self, because it doesn't ask God to protect the illusion. It asks truth to enter. And when truth enters, it does not always feel comforting at first. Sometimes it feels like being stripped. Sometimes it feels like silence. Sometimes it feels like nothing is happening because the deeper work is happening below the surface. So what do you do when prayer is empty? You stop trying to force it to feel full. You stop demanding that every prayer produce an emotional experience. You stop judging your connection to God by whether your body feels warm, peaceful, or inspired. Instead, you simplify. Sit down. Breathe. Tell the truth. Don't polish the truth. Say the real truth. Perhaps it's, God, I don't feel anything. Or God, I'm angry. Or God, I feel abandoned. That is prayer. Not because the words are perfect, but because they're honest. And then you listen differently. Not for thunder. Not for a dramatic sign. Not for a voice that fixes everything immediately. Listen for what becomes clear after you stop performing. Listen for the small movement toward honesty. The quiet realization. The softened breath. The next right step. The willingness to not abandon yourself while you feel abandoned. That may be the answer. Not the answer your fear demanded, but the answer your soul could actually receive. In real life, this means you pray and still make the call. You pray and still apologize. You pray and still set the boundary. Because prayer is not meant to replace your life. Prayer is meant to bring truth into it. So if prayer feels empty when you need God the most, don't rush to condemn yourself. Don't assume you have failed. And don't assume God has left. Look deeper. Maybe the emptiness is not the absence of God. Maybe it's the absence of the old image. Maybe the mind is reaching for a version of God that can no longer carry you. Maybe prayer is becoming less about getting a feeling and more about becoming real. Because the deepest prayer is not always filled with emotion. Sometimes the deepest prayer is bare. Quiet, unimpressive, wordless. A single thread of honesty in the middle of pain. And that's enough. You don't have to feel God perfectly to be held by God. You don't have to speak beautifully to be heard. You don't have to manufacture faith to be close to what is already closer than thought. Prayer might feel empty, but emptiness is not the end. Sometimes emptiness is the doorway where the false image falls away, and the real presence begins to be recognized. Not as something arriving from far away, but as what was quietly holding you, even when you couldn't even feel it. Faith feels different when you're exhausted. It's easy to talk about trusting God when your life feels manageable. It's easy to believe your mind is clear when your body has energy, when prayer feels warm, when hope still has some strength behind it. But when you are deeply tired, faith can feel almost impossible. Not because you hate God, and not because you stop believing, but because exhaustion changes the way everything feels. When you're worn down, even hope can feel heavy. Prayer can feel empty. Trust can feel like another responsibility you are too tired to carry. You may still want to believe, but something in you feels too drained to reach. And that is where guilt creeps in. You start thinking, why is my faith so weak? Why can't I trust better? Why do I feel so far from God? But sometimes, faith does not feel hard because you lack devotion. Sometimes, faith feels hard because you are exhausted from surviving. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep alone doesn't fix. It's not just physical fatigue, it's emotional overload. It is the tiredness that comes from trying to stay strong for too long, trying to keep going when life keeps asking more from you, trying to trust God while secretly wondering when relief is finally going to come. And when you're in that place, even simple spiritual ideas can feel painful. Someone says to you, just have faith, and part of you wants to believe them, but another part of you feels almost angry, because you have been having faith, you have been praying, you've been trying, you've been holding on, and you're still tired. This is the inner conflict. You don't necessarily want to give up on God. You just don't know how to keep carrying the same weight with a smile on your face. And this matters, because many people mistake exhaustion for failure. They think, if I were really spiritual, I would feel peace. If I truly trusted God, I wouldn't be this overwhelmed. But that's not always true. Sometimes the most honest prayer isn't beautiful. Sometimes it sounds like, God, I'm tired. Sometimes it sounds like, I don't know what to do. Sometimes it's not even words. Sometimes it's just tears. And that still counts. The mind creates an image of faith as constant certainty. It tells you faith should feel strong, clear, and peaceful. So when you feel weak, confused, or tired, the mind assumes something has gone wrong. It says, God must be far away. You must be doing something wrong. If you really believed, you wouldn't feel this way. But the mind is measuring faith by emotional energy. And that's the mistake. Because exhaustion changes perception. When you're tired, the future looks darker. Problems look bigger. Silence feels louder. Even God's nearness can become hard to recognize because your nervous system is overloaded. A tired mind can turn delay into rejection. A tired heart can turn silence into abandonment. A tired body can make even ordinary life feel impossible. This doesn't mean your conclusions are always true. It means your system is depleted. You can honor what you feel without believing every story your exhaustion tells you. You can say, I feel abandoned, without declaring, God has abandoned me. You can say, I feel weak, without deciding, my faith is gone. You can say, I can't feel God right now, without turning that into proof that God is absent. Because God is not only present when you feel inspired. God is also present when you are barely holding yourself together. Faith is not supposed to become another burden. Faith is not one more thing you have to perform correctly while you are already breaking down. God is not standing over your exhaustion with a clipboard, measuring whether you are trusting well enough. That image has to be broken. Many people are not actually struggling with God. They are struggling with the image of God their mind created. A God who is disappointed. A God who only comes close when they are strong. A God who blesses them when they perform well and withdraws when they collapse. But that's not the presence that heals. That is pressure wearing the mask of religion. Real faith isn't, I must hold everything together so God will approve of me. Real faith is, I cannot hold everything together, and maybe I was never meant to. When you are exhausted, faith may not look like rising with power. It may look like resting without shame. It may not look like certainty. It may look like honesty. It may not look like spiritual confidence. It may look like finally admitting, God, I need help. And that's not weakness in the wrong sense. That is surrender, becoming real. Not dramatic surrender, not poetic surrender, but actual surrender. The kind where you stop pretending you are fine. The monad is the undivided source beneath all changing experiences. Before your thoughts arise, before your emotions shift, before your faith feels strong or weak. Your exhausted self may feel far from God, but the deepest part of you is not outside of the source. It is appearing within the source. This matters because exhaustion convinces you that you have fallen out of grace. But grace is not something you only enter when you feel spiritual. Grace is the field holding you, even when you feel empty. The monad points toward the one beneath the many, the stillness beneath the storm, the presence beneath the personality that is trying so hard to manage everything. So when faith feels hard, the answer is not always to force stronger belief. Sometimes the invitation is to stop identifying completely with the exhausted mind. The tired mind says, I can't feel God. The deeper awareness says, even this tiredness is being held in God. The tired mind says, I am failing. The deeper awareness says, something false is being stripped away. The tired mind says, I have no faith left. The deeper awareness says, then let faith become simple. Maybe today, faith is not certainty. Maybe today, faith is one breath, one honest prayer, one moment where you do not abandon yourself, one small act of trust that says, I don't feel strong, but I'm still here. Exhaustion is not revelation. Just because a thought feels convincing when you're tired doesn't mean it's true. When you're depleted, your mind may tell you nothing is working. Your prayers are pointless. Your healing is fake. Your path has failed. God is silent because God doesn't care. But be careful. Pain speaks loudly. Fear speaks with authority. Exhaustion can sound like wisdom when it is really just your system begging for rest. Not every inner voice deserves your obedience. Some thoughts are just tiredness wearing the mask of truth. This is why you need gentleness, but you also need clarity. Do not spiritualize burnout. Do not call self-neglect devotion. Do not confuse constant striving with faithfulness. God is not asking you to prove your trust by ignoring your humanity. If your body is exhausted, rest matters. If your emotions are overloaded, honesty matters. If your mind is spiraling, grounding matters. If life feels too heavy, support matters. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is stop punishing yourself for being human. Go drink some water. Eat something healthy. Take a walk. Turn off the noise. Let your prayer become simple. God, help me through this moment. That's enough. In real life, this looks quite ordinary. It looks like not forcing yourself into a profound prayer when all you can say is, "Help me." It looks like sitting in silence without trying to manufacture a spiritual feeling. It looks like letting tears be the prayer. It looks like admitting, "I'm tired, angry, and scared. I don't know what to do." It looks like choosing not to make permanent decisions from a depleted state. It looks like simplifying your faith until it becomes livable again. Not, "I must understand God's entire plan." Just, "God, be with me today." Not, "I must feel completely surrendered." Just, "Help me loosen my grip." Not, "I must be spiritually strong." Just, "Help me not turn against myself again." This is true faith. Not performance. Not pretending. Not trying to sound more healed than you are. Faith becomes real when it is allowed to meet your actual condition. God doesn't need your polished version. God can meet you in the tired version, the quiet version, the uncertain version, the version that has no impressive words left. And sometimes, that is where faith becomes deeper. Because when you stop performing strength, you become available to be held. So, if faith feels hard right now, don't immediately assume you are failing. Look honestly. Are you faithless, or are you exhausted? Are you disconnected from God, or are you overwhelmed by a mind and body that have been carrying too much for too long? There's a difference, and that difference matters. Because the answer may not be to force more belief. The answer may be to soften the burden you placed on belief. You don't have to feel powerful to be held. You don't have to feel certain to be loved. You don't have to turn your exhaustion into something inspiring before God can meet you there. The presence of God is not waiting for the polished version of you. It is here, beneath the tired thoughts, beneath the heavy emotions, beneath the silence you keep interpreting as absence. Sometimes faith is simply this: one breath, one honest prayer, one small opening, one quiet refusal to abandon yourself. You are not outside of God because your faith feels small. Sometimes the smallest faith is the most sincere. And sometimes the exhausted heart is not far from God at all. Sometimes it is finally close enough to stop pretending. There is a moment when silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling personal. You pray, and nothing changes. You ask for help, and nothing answers. You reach toward God from the most exhausted place in your heart, and instead of comfort, you meet stillness. And the mind does what the mind does when it's afraid. It explains the silence in the most painful way possible. God has left me. God is ignoring me. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I'm being punished. But here's the truth we have to look at clearly. Silence does not automatically mean abandonment. Silence becomes abandonment when the wounded mind becomes the translator. Because when you're tired, scared, and emotionally worn down, silence doesn't feel neutral. It feels like rejection. It feels like distance. It feels like reaching for a hand in the dark and grabbing onto nothing. Sometimes what feels like absence is actually the collapse of the false image you were using to understand presence. Let's be honest. When you're suffering, silence hurts. It's easy to talk about faith when life is stable. It's easy to talk about surrender when your body is calm, your bills are paid, your relationship feels safe, and your mind isn't spinning at midnight. But when you're really in it, silence can feel brutal. You're not asking for luxury. You're not asking for applause. Sometimes, all you want is one sign that God still sees you. One inner warmth. One confirmation. One moment of relief. When that doesn't come, the mind starts building a case. If God loved me, I would feel him. If God cared, this would be changing. If God were near, I wouldn't feel so alone. That's the wound underneath the wound. Not just pain. Pain plus the belief that you have been left alone inside it. And that belief is what makes the silence unbearable. But the feeling of abandonment is not always the fact of abandonment. Sometimes, it's the old wound rising up inside the divine. The mind often creates a version of God that behaves like a human authority figure, like a distant parent, a disappointed judge, a king on a throne deciding whether you have earned help or not. So when silence appears, the mind does not simply say, "I don't know what this means." It says, "God must be upset with me. God must not care. He must be testing me. He must have turned away." But what if that interpretation is not God? What if it's your fear wearing the mask of theology? Many people are not only struggling with God's silence, they're struggling with the image of God their mind created inside the silence. If people ignored you when you needed them, silence may feel like abandonment. If love had to be earned, silence may feel like failure. If authority was harsh, silence may feel like punishment. So the mind takes divine mystery and filters it through human pain. Then it calls that conclusion truth. But it's not the truth. It's a wound speaking in spiritual language. God beyond the mind cannot be reduced to the mind's trauma-based image of God. Sometimes the false image has to break before real faith can breathe. The mind wants God to appear as something it can detect, a feeling, a sign, a wave of comfort. And yes, sometimes grace does move that way. Sometimes the sign comes, or the door opens. Sometimes peace arrives suddenly, and you know you're being held by God. But God is not limited to what the mind can notice. God is not merely an experience inside awareness. God is the ground in which awareness appears. That means God can be present even when no special feeling is present. God can be near even when your emotions feel empty. God can be moving even when your mind cannot measure movement. The mind says, if I can't feel God, God must be absent. But the soul begins to learn, maybe God is deeper than the feeling I expected. This is difficult because the mind wants God to become an object it can point to. But God beyond the mind is not always an object. Sometimes God is the unseen ground holding you, while every object falls away. What the Gnostics called the monad points toward this deeper reality. It's not a concept to worship. It's not a replacement for devotion, but a way of pointing toward undivided source. The one before thought divides reality into separate pieces. The silent fullness beneath all appearances. From the level of the mind, silence feels empty. But from the level of the monad, silence isn't empty at all. It's undivided. It has not yet become answer, sign, or emotional comfort. It is fullness before form, and this is where the mind struggles. The mind wants form. The mind wants God to arrive in a way it can recognize. But the monad points to a presence that does not depend on appearance, a unity that is not broken because your emotions are tired, a divine reality that remains whole, even when your thoughts are fragmented. So when silence comes, the question becomes, will you let the wounded mind define silence as abandonment? Or will you allow silence to reveal where your faith was still dependent on constant proof? This is not about pretending pain feels good. It is about refusing to confuse the absence of emotional certainty with the absence of God. The mind would rather believe it has been abandoned than admit it does not know what silence means. Because abandonment is painful, but at least it's an answer. At least now the silence has a story. At least now there is someone to blame. At least now the mind does not have to stand naked before mystery. But mystery is where the mind loses control. And the mind hates losing control. So it turns silence into a verdict. God left. God failed me. God doesn't care. But look carefully. Is that revelation? Or is that fear trying to escape not knowing? The loneliness may be real. The exhaustion may be real. The ache in your chest may be real. but the conclusion your mind adds isn't. A feeling can be honest without being ultimate. You may feel alone without being alone. You may feel lost while still being guided. You may feel nothing while something sacred is happening beneath conscious perception. Don't build your understanding of God from your most exhausted hour. Don't let fear write scripture inside your chest. Name the pain. Honor the feeling. But don't crown the wound as truth. In real life, this looks simple. It looks like praying honestly instead of performing spiritually. God, I don't understand this. I feel abandoned. I'm tired. That may be more real than forcing beautiful words you don't even mean. It looks like letting silence be silence before calling it rejection. It looks like not making permanent conclusions about God from temporary exhaustion. It looks like placing your hand on your chest and reminding your body this silence is uncomfortable, but it doesn't automatically mean danger. It looks like asking yourself, what am I assuming the silence means? Then asking, do I absolutely know what is true? Because often, you're not reacting to silence itself. You're reacting to the story your mind created about the silence. The practice is not to fake peace. The practice is to stop letting fear be the only interpreter. Faith here is not dramatic. It's one breath. One honest prayer. One refusal to turn pain into proof. One quiet decision to stay open, even while you don't understand. So, if God feels silent right now, don't rush to condemn yourself. Don't assume your faith is broken. And don't assume you've been abandoned. Look closer. The mind may be turning silence into abandonment because uncertainty feels unsafe. It may be projecting old wounds onto divine mystery. It may be trying to protect you from the vulnerability of not knowing. But God beyond the mind is not gone just because the mind cannot feel Him. The monad is not absent because the emotional body is tired. The one is not broken because your thoughts are loud. Sometimes silence is not the proof that God has left. Sometimes silence is the space where your false image of God stops working. And that can feel like loss before it feels like freedom. But stay with it. Not by forcing certainty, not by pretending you're fine, but by refusing to let fear have the final word. Because silence is not always abandonment. Sometimes silence is the place where false certainty dies, and real recognition begins. There are moments in life where pain doesn't just hurt. It changes the way reality feels. You pray, but nothing changes. You cry, but no one answers. You try to stay faithful, but deep down, a darker thought begins to form. God, where are you? Not in a casual way, not as some philosophical question, but from the floor. From exhaustion, from grief, from panic, from the moment where you have done everything you know how to do, and still God feels silent. That is when God can feel hidden. Not because you stop believing, but because the version of God your mind expected to find is not appearing in the way you demanded. And that's terrifying. Because when you are in your darkest moment, you're not looking for theology. You're not looking for a clever spiritual explanation. You're looking for presence. You're looking for proof that you haven't been abandoned. But what if God isn't hidden? What if He's not absent? What if it's the collapse of the image you were using to recognize Him? Let's be honest. When people say, God is always with you, that can sound beautiful when life is calm. But when you're breaking inside, those words can almost feel cruel. Because you're thinking, if God is with me, why do I feel so empty? If God loves me, why am I still suffering? If God hears me, why does the silence feel so loud? And this is where many people start blaming themselves. They think maybe their faith is weak. Maybe they're being punished. Maybe they did something wrong. Maybe God has pulled away because they're not spiritual enough, pure enough, or obedient enough. But darkness already hurts enough without adding shame on top of it. Sometimes the pain is not proof that God has left. Sometimes the pain is revealing how deeply your mind has attached God to outcomes. When life works, God feels close. When life falls apart, God feels gone. When prayers are answered, God feels real. When prayers aren't answered, God feels hidden. But that means your sense of God has become dependent on circumstances, and life will eventually shake that. Not to destroy your faith, but to deepen it beyond conditions. The mind wants God to be understandable, predictable, manageable. The mind wants a God it can locate, explain, and control. A God who shows up when requested. A God who fixes the situation before fear becomes too intense. A God who proves love by removing discomfort. And when that doesn't happen, the mind calls it abandonment. But what the mind is really losing isn't God. It's losing its image of God. The mind often imagines God as a distant figure watching from somewhere else, deciding whether to step in or not. So when suffering comes, the mind looks upward and says, "Why are you not helping me?" But that picture may be too small. God is not merely an object outside of you, entering and leaving your life according to your emotional weather. God is not hidden because He moved away. But the deepest presence does not always announce itself as rescue. Sometimes it appears as endurance. Sometimes as the one breath you can still take. Sometimes as the strange strength that keeps you from completely collapsing. And sometimes as the quiet refusal inside of you that says, "I don't know how I will get through this, but I'm still here." That may not look dramatic, but don't underestimate it. There are moments where survival itself is grace. In your darkest moments, God may feel hidden because you are looking for God as an experience, a feeling, a sign, a sudden emotional rescue. But God is not limited to what the nervous system can feel. When you're exhausted, your body may not feel peace. When you're grieving, your heart may not feel joy. When you're afraid, your mind may not feel trust. And if you confuse God with those feelings, then the absence of those feelings will seem like the absence of God. But peace is not always calm emotion. Faith is not always confidence. Presence is not always warmth. Sometimes faith is trembling and still not giving up. Sometimes presence is silence that does not explain itself. Sometimes God is not felt as comfort. Sometimes God is known as the deeper ground beneath the fact that you have not vanished. This is difficult because the mind wants God to arrive as an answer. But sometimes God is revealed as the space in which the question is allowed to burn. Not because God is cruel, but because the false self cannot survive without certainty. And the deepest truth within you is not built from certainty. It's built from being. The monad is not a replacement for God. It is a way of pointing toward the undivided source beneath all separation. The mind experiences life in fragments. Me and God. Pain and peace. Near and far. Lost and found. But the monad points to what exists before division. The one source beneath all appearances. The ground of being that does not disappear when the surface of life becomes chaotic. So when God feels hidden, it may be because the mind is trapped inside separation. It is looking for God over there, somewhere else, behind the clouds, above the pain, past the suffering. But the monad points inward and beyond inward at the same time. It says, the presence you seek is not absent. It is beneath the one who is seeking. That doesn't mean your pain is fake. It doesn't mean your suffering doesn't matter. It means the deepest truth is not erased by suffering. Darkness can cover your perception, but it cannot destroy the source. Clouds can hide the sun from your eyes, but they do not extinguish the flames. In the same way, fear can hide God from your awareness, but fear does not remove God from reality. If I can't feel God, then God isn't here. That's not truth. That's pain interpreting silence. And pain is powerful. But pain is not always accurate. When you're in survival mode, your mind becomes a threat detector. It scans for danger. It expects loss. It turns uncertainty into doom. It turns silence into abandonment. It turns emotional numbness into spiritual failure. So during your darkest moments, you cannot always trust the conclusions your fear is making. You can respect the pain. You can honor the ache. You can admit the exhaustion. But you don't have to build your theology from the most wounded moment. You don't have to decide who God is while your nervous system is drowning. You don't have to conclude that you are already abandoned just because you cannot feel comfort right now. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can say is not, I understand. Sometimes it's, I don't understand, but I won't let fear define God for me. That's not weakness. That's spiritual honesty. So what does this look like in your real life? It may look like sitting on the edge of your bed and saying, God, I don't feel anything, but I'm still here. It may look like crying without turning your tears into shame. It may look like taking one small step instead of demanding a full map. It may look like cleaning one corner of the room, or choosing not to make a permanent decision from temporary despair. It may look like letting silence be silence without immediately calling it abandonment. It may look like remembering that even Jesus cried out, "Why have you forsaken me?" That cry was not faithlessness. It was anguish spoken honestly. And sometimes honest anguish is closer to God than fake spiritual confidence. Because God does not need your performance. God meets what is real. And sometimes what is real is messy. It's tired, angry, and confused. Barely holding on, but still turned toward truth. And that counts. Don't let anyone convince you that faith only looks peaceful. Sometimes faith looks like surviving the night without betraying your soul. So if God feels hidden during your darkest moments, don't be so hard on yourself. Don't assume that you have failed. Don't assume that you've been rejected. Look within. Maybe God is not gone. Maybe the image you were using to recognize God is being stripped away. Maybe the mind is losing its ability to control the mystery. Maybe what feels like absence is actually an invitation into a deeper kind of presence. Not presence based on emotions. Not presence based on answered prayers. But presence beneath it all. God feels hidden because the mind cannot grasp what has always been underneath the storm. And when the storm passes, you may look back and realize something strange. You were held in ways you could not feel, guided in ways you could not understand, and strengthened in ways you didn't recognize. Not because the darkness was good, but because even there, the deepest light was not destroyed. There is a silence that does not mean absence. There is a silence so vast that the mind mistakes it for abandonment, because the mind only knows how to recognize what moves, speaks, and answers. But the deepest presence does not always announce itself. Before the world had language, there was silence. Before scripture, before prayer, before temples, before the mind ever formed an image of God, there was the silent depth from which all things emerged. So when God goes silent, the question may not be, why has God left? The deeper question may be, what part of me can only recognize God when God becomes small enough to be heard? Because the infinite does not always speak in words. Sometimes, the infinite withdraws every familiar signal so the soul can encounter what exists before sound, before thought, before identity. The silence of God may not be punishment. It may not even be presence in the way the human heart expects presence. It may be initiation, a sacred unmaking, a doorway into the mystery behind the voice. Every ancient path understood this pattern. Before revelation, there is wilderness. Before vision, there is darkness. Before the prophet can speak, the prophet is silenced. Moses meets God in fire, but only after exile in desert. Elijah hears not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the still small presence beyond spectacle. Christ enters the wilderness before ministry. The mystics entered caves, mountains, and monasteries. Even in Gnostic imagination, the visible world is not the final truth. It is a layered reality, a realm of forms, names, and powers. The soul must pass beyond the noise of the archons, beyond the structures that claim authority, beyond the false lights that imitate the divine. The desert is not just a place. The cave is not just a shelter. The dark night is not just depression. These are symbols of the same spiritual architecture. The soul is taken away from the marketplace of noise and placed before the unspeaking source. Not to be comforted, to be emptied. Not to be entertained by visions, but to lose dependence on visions. Not to be abandoned, but to discover what remains when every external voice disappears. The hidden principle is this: sound belongs to manifestation. Silence belongs to source. Everything that appears must vibrate in some way. A word is vibration. A thought is vibration. The world is vibration. Even the body is a field of movement. Creation speaks because creation is motion. But the absolute is prior to motion. The deepest source is not one more voice inside reality. It is the silent ground from which every voice arises. This is why divine silence can feel so terrifying. The ego is made of movement. It survives through thought, memory, and emotion. The ego needs God to be an object, a voice, a sign, a response, a presence it can locate and say, "There, that is God. Now I understand." But the source cannot be possessed that way. The source is not hiding inside silence. The source is the silence beneath everything. When God becomes silent, the mind loses the object it was trying to hold. And when the mind can no longer hold God as an object, the soul stands at the edge of formlessness. This is why silence is initiation. It removes the idol of spiritual certainty. It strips away the lesser gods of emotion, proof, explanation, and control. It returns the seeker to the beginning. Before speech, before concepts, before me and God appeared as two. Ordinary consciousness misunderstands silence because ordinary consciousness lives inside separation. It imagines God as elsewhere, somewhere above and far away, watching and judging, withholding and deciding whether to answer or not. From this false reality, silence becomes a message of rejection. The mind says, God isn't speaking, so God is gone. But that assumption belongs to the world of distance. It belongs to the illusion that God and the soul are separated by space. The false reality says God must travel toward you. The deeper truth says you exist inside God before you ever begin searching. The false reality says God must speak to prove presence. The deeper truth says speech is only necessary where separation is believed. The false reality says silence means nothing is happening. The deeper truth says silence is where the deepest transformations occur, because the mind cannot interfere with what it cannot grasp. The seed grows in darkness. The child forms in the womb. The stars are born inside cosmic obscurity. The soul is remade in hiddenness. The false reality worships noise because noise gives the illusion of control. But the sacred often works beneath perception. There comes a point where silence becomes a threshold. You reach the edge where prayer no longer functions as request. Faith no longer functions as certainty. Spiritual identity no longer functions as protection. You can't use belief to escape the unknown anymore. You can't use language to cover the abyss. You can't use teachings to avoid direct encounter. And this is where the old self begins to tremble. Because the old self was built on answers. It knew what God was. It knew what faith meant. It knew which role to play. But divine silence burns through spiritual role play. It exposes the one who is trying to use God as a mirror for the ego. The one who wanted to be chosen. The one who wanted to be certain. The one who wanted divine intimacy without death of illusion. This is the threshold of initiation. The soul stands before the silent gate, and nothing false can enter. Not the mask, not the performance, not your borrowed theology or your spiritual personality. Only what is real can pass through the gate. The revelation is not that God finally speaks. The revelation is that silence was never empty. The silence was full. Full like the night sky, like the space between stars, like the breath before creation. The soul begins to realize that God's silence was not the withholding of love. It was the removal of distortion. The mind wanted an answer, but the spirit was being shown the ground beneath all answers. The mind wanted comfort, but the spirit was being drawn into a presence deeper than comfort. The mind wanted proof, but the spirit was being invited beyond the need for proof. A quiet recognition appears. God wasn't absent. The image was. The expectation was. The familiar form was absent. But the source was never absent. It was always there. The source cannot be absent because there is nowhere outside of it for absence to occur. This is the mystery. God doesn't merely enter silence. God is discovered when silence becomes transparent. So after your spiritual initiation, how do you return to your everyday life? Not by floating above life, not detached from the human heart, not pretending suffering no longer matters. The return is quieter than that. You still live in your body. You still feel grief. You still face uncertainty. You still have questions. But something has changed. You no longer worship every emotional weather pattern as ultimate truth. You no longer assume that silence means rejection. You no longer demand that the infinite perform constantly so the mind can feel safe. You begin to notice the sacred in places that don't announce themselves, like breath, a pause, a dark room, a delayed answer, a season of waiting, a prayer without fireworks, a moment where nothing changes externally, but something within you stops fighting the void. This doesn't make life easier. It makes it deeper. Because now silence is not merely something to escape. It is something to listen through. Not for a voice that will rescue the ego, but for the presence underneath the ego's panic. The human world remains, but the world is no longer sealed shut. The invisible has entered. So, is the silence of God punishment, presence, or initiation? To the frightened mind, it feels like punishment. To the awakening heart, it may become presence. But to the soul standing at the threshold of mystery, it is initiation. It is the dark temple where the false image of God falls silent. It is the desert where borrowed certainty dies. It is the cave where the ego cannot echo forever. It is the womb where a deeper faith forms without being watched. The silence of God is sacredly dangerous because it does not flatter the self. It does not entertain the seeker. It does not give the mind another object to possess. It draws you beyond the voice into the source of the voice. Beyond the sign into the source of signs. Beyond belief into direct encounter with the mystery beneath belief. And perhaps this is why silence feels so unbearable. Not because God is gone, but because the part of you that needed God to be manageable is dissolving. The silence is not the end of the path. It is the hidden door. And once you pass through it, you may realize something the mind could never accept. God wasn't silent because there was nothing to say. God was silent because the deepest truth cannot be spoken. If this journey spoke to you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone ready to experience life beyond thought. Comment below. Have you ever felt God's silence as punishment, only to later wonder if it was something deeper? I read every comment. If you would like to support my work directly, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/magnumopus333. Or you can explore some original merchandise at my Teespring store online. The link is in the description below. Remember, your consciousness is the key that unlocks reality. Let's keep unlocking it together. Thank you for watching. Until next time.